Natalie Yeadon. I'm the CEO with Impetus Digital. At Impetus Digital, we have built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous communication tools for pharmaceutical companies. We have worked with companies from across the globe over the past 14 years to help them with everything from virtual medical education to peer influence programs like ambassador programs and things at conferences, and also things like insight gathering through things like advisory boards and investigator meetings, et cetera. So we do all these really interesting things online, helping our clients through a series of touch points, consulting and giving all kinds of ideas. So we have both the online platform as well as all of the medical and consulting and project management. So we make it really easy to doing these things virtually, especially now in the world of hybrid meetings. But most importantly at Impetus, we really believe that everything starts with a conversation. And from some of these big, hairy, audacious conversations with some of the leading edge thinkers, digital provocateurs, and healthcare thought leaders, is we can all work together to collectively and positively disrupt healthcare. So I'm super excited about having one of these healthcare table with me today. This is actually Savva Kerdemelidis. He's actually a legal consultant with over 18 years experience advising software and technology companies in relation to IP, commercial law, as well as crypto. So he is admitted as a barrister and solicitor of the High Court of New Zealand and lawyer in the Supreme Court of Queensland, Australia. He is also a New Zealand and Australian patent and trademark attorney. He founded a company called Crowdfunded Cures as a New Zealand charity in 2013, which he is launching as a Web3 project and a public good pharma company to implement the idea of using interventional pharmacoeconomics. So we're going to find out a little bit what that means, as well as pay for success contracts to fund new uses for off-patent drugs and other unmonopolizable, that's actually a mouthful, therapies. So happy to have you, Savva. Thanks for being on the show today.
Hi, Natalie. Thanks very much for having me.
Absolutely. I'm really excited about this conversation because we don't oftentimes have people in the legal profession who suddenly turn entrepreneur. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about your career trajectory and how you ended up landing in a place where you started a company today.
Yeah, so I mean, my family have always been quite involved with technology, and then more recently on the crypto side of things, my brother has also been involved with a project, Kuva, which is a DeFi project, so decentralized finance for basically allowing payments online, and that's out of Zimbabwe in Africa. But yeah, my background actually is mainly commercial and IP law, and I've been advising a lot of entrepreneurs and startups. I've always been very interested in technology, but also I studied biology, and my thesis was on the gaps basically in the patent system, particularly for medicines, and incentivizing development of medicines. So during the pandemic, I really saw this was a real problem, particularly with a lot of arguments about things like ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, things like that, and realizing that people are still arguing about things like off-label prescriptions and whether supplements work and whether diets work. And so I thought this was really an opportunity to go forward with this and really try and bring it to and make do something about it.
Absolutely. So you have gone ahead and so tell us a little bit about the evolution. You started the company as a charity. So how did it go, and how did it and why did it go from a charity to an actual company? Tell us a little bit about what that journey was, and I guess the original inception or the idea behind what the company was in the first place.
So the idea, as I mentioned, came from my thesis. I was looking at this particular gap in the patent system for what I would called unmonopolizable therapies. And essentially, these are therapies where you can't enforce a monopoly price. So it's well recognized, for instance, that a generic drug it's very difficult to stop people taking a generic drug off label. And what tends to happen is that once a generic drug does go off label, it's much less likely to be repurposed for a new use, unless you can reformulate it. And oftentimes that's seen as like not very innovative, or it's basically a lot of drugs, actually the original formulation might be slightly better. So we have this perhaps happening with a drug called S-ketamine, which is a treatment for treatment-resistant depression. But the original formulation ketamine is also very, very effective, might be even more effective. But there are other examples like that, but that didn't exist at the time. But the charity was set up basically to test this idea of crowdfunding a prize. That's why we called it crowdfunded cures. And it wasn't a direct crowdfunding. It was a little bit like Kickstarter. And the idea was that you have almost like an agreement to pre-purchase clinical trial data, and that acts as a kind of pull incentive. And since then, we've evolved away from this crowdfunding model and more onto more of a commercial model, looking at what we call advanced market commitments, which are a little bit like a prize, and also this idea of interventional pharmacoeconomics, which we can talk about. But yeah, we are still a charity, actually, but we are in the process of converting into a social enterprise where the charity would own the company or part of the company. And we are, we have a bit of a team now of a few core team members and a broader team of volunteers. But the idea is essentially to build this as a scalable business, because if you're a charity, it's not really sort of sustainable. And the idea is to create a business model around doing this kind of research.
So you've sort of set up a little bit the problem statement of what exists right now in the health and the ecosystem that surrounds that, around drug development, the need to developing these drugs, how long it takes, how expensive it is, and then the whole thing around. I'm wondering if we can articulate that a little bit to sort of for the problem statement about what happens to these drugs, why they kind of fall off the rails, and what your intention is on the future of drugs.
Yeah, so just to articulate that, I guess with the example of ketamine versus S-ketamine, at the moment, ketamine is extremely cheap. So you could, it maybe cost $2 a dose. And because it's so cheap and so low cost and cheaply available, there are limited private incentives to fund clinical trials, say to find new uses for ketamine therapeutically. And this could happen with a lot of other drugs. There is, or even medical diets or nutraceuticals. There are maybe 7,500 off-patent drugs and 50,000 or so nutraceuticals. And these drugs and nutraceuticals could be very useful treatments for new diseases and many serious diseases. But if it's not possible to charge a very high price for these drugs, then because they're available for very low cost and they can be used off-label, it creates a disincentive to fund clinical trials, essentially, under the current patent system. So our idea is to use contracts, contractual innovation, and clinical trial design, essentially to provide a business model for funding this research. And essentially, the idea is to say that if the clinical trials are successful, then you'll receive an outcome payment for the data. So it's a little bit like monetizing clinical trial data in a platform and getting an agreement from a health insurer or a government to basically pay for access to this data, where you have I guess a proprietary database. However, the issue is that a lot of the time when the data is published, then everyone can benefit from that data. So in order to prevent free riding or to allow a business model around that, you can enter into a pay for success contract with large payers, health insurers, and also enforce method of use patents to sort of prevent those, at least the healthcare systems, from prescribing off-label. But the real, I think, innovation, and this is something we've only really thought about in the last few months, is this idea of interventional pharmacoeconomics. And I can go into that a little bit. I'm happy to do that.
Absolutely. I'd be interested to see how that ties in and what is that concept?
Sure. So it was really used originally actually for this drug called Herceptin. I understand you're familiar with this. It's was very expensive when it first came out. And a lot of healthcare systems found, I think particularly in New Zealand, and I think some ones overseas, maybe Italy and Holland, found that you could take a much shorter course of the drug, and it would still have similar efficacy. So a 3-month course would have similar efficacy to a 12-month course. And what happens if you're only taking it for a quarter of the time, then that's has a lot less of a cost impact, and then perhaps also a much lower side effect profile. So the idea is that, and obviously though, doing that would, you need to do a clinical trial to determine if that's possible. But the idea is that by doing these clinical trials, it is actually possible to fund the clinical trial through the cost saving from putting one treatment arm on a much shorter course of the drug or lower dose of the drug. You can save, say, 3/4 of the amount of money, which might be, say, $50,000 a year. And that would be enough actually to fund the clinical trial, which in some cases could be $10,000 per patient. In other cases, it might be $30,000, $40,000 per patient. But it basically creates a mechanism to pay for the clinical trials from cost savings. And this is in the same way, although this hasn't been done yet, you could also use a low-cost generic drug where you are randomizing people to put them on a low-cost treatment or a nutraceutical or a diet, and use that cost difference between that and usual care, and in some cases could be $100,000 or more, particularly for cancer drugs, to actually go to the healthcare system and say, we can manage this patient population for you, and we were going to randomize them. And just by doing that and putting half of the people on a much lower cost drug, you could actually get even better outcomes, or as equivalent outcomes as the very expensive therapy. But that happens, those cost savings are locked in, even if the drug doesn't necessarily show equivalence. You still can start with very small clinical trial and then scale into a bigger clinical trial, but you're still getting those cost savings by putting half of the people on a much lower cost drug or therapy, and then use that actually to scale and basically create clinical trial data out of cost savings. So we think that's a very elegant model for funding clinical research, basically out of cost savings. And if the clinical trials are successful, you can scale up and eventually get as much data that you need to get to clinical approval, say for ketamine to get FDA approved to treat treatment-resistant depression, which might save billions and billions of dollars in monopoly prices, or if you could have a very low-cost generic drug that maybe outcompetes the much more expensive drugs.
So the interesting thing here, in the traditional pharmaceutical model, it's pharmaceutical companies that have created this relic or this legacy business model, whatever you're going to call a pharmacoeconomic model of, and I understand, I think our internet connection is not great, listeners. And so we see that there was a way to make money. And as you were mentioning, unless they were going to be able to monetize this in a significant way on the back end, people are not going to do these products. So the question are not going to be your customer. Your customer, governments and payers. How do you go about targeting your customers? What is the business model, and how do you lay out this interventional pharmacoeconomic model in front of them for them to see the short versus long-term savings that they are going to accrue?
Sure. I think we can act as an intermediary with, say, a provider. So you have a healthcare system, and similar to, I guess, the Impetus product, you would have a platform where you could offer to say, we can manage this patient population for you. And where costs are an issue, we can manage this patient population by recruiting them into a clinical trial. And just by doing this interventional pharmacoeconomic clinical trial with specific patient populations, obviously. So say, with example, with ketamine, if they're spending a lot of money on esketamine at this stage, we can offer to recruit those patients into a clinical trial and save costs for them. At the same, as I mentioned, just by recruiting and conducting this clinical trial, you are saving costs. And then that also is generating very helpful data that if the clinical trial is successful, in a smaller clinical trial, you can scale to a larger one and manage a much larger patient population. And eventually that data will generate enough data to support reimbursing ketamine, a much lower drug, and putting a lot more patients on ketamine. You can also determine which patients are super responders and which patients maybe don't respond because of their genetic profile. So and that data isn't normally something that a pharmaceutical company might want to produce. So it's very helpful to know for a healthcare system which drugs work and which ones don't, particularly for patients. So the initial customers would be those health insurers that want to lower costs and want to determine which drugs are very effective, and low-cost drugs particularly are effective for their patients so they can save costs. And initially, we think, particularly in the US, self-insured employers would probably be the most concerned about cost containment because of it affects their bottom line. And government-funded agencies, say Health Canada, NHS, also CMS in the US, and Veterans Affairs, US Army. The issue with a lot of health insurers at the moment is, although they talk about things like value-based pricing and capitated payments and bulk payments, there's not a lot of incentive to actually lower costs, particularly even for the providers. If you lower the costs of the US healthcare system from $4 trillion to $2 trillion, then that's basically reducing a lot of sales. And there's even though it might be 20% of GDP, but I think with the aging baby boomer population, there are definitely the tides turning, and there is more focus on these using contractual innovation to help create these incentives to essentially and be more efficient with your healthcare spend.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, absolutely. Now it's interesting because the major part of your model is really around the clinical trial funding and development and being able to get this important data for drugs that have been off patent or been genericized. Now, one of the issues has to do with being able to attract investigators. Investigators are always oftentimes, working with the big pharma companies. They get the big payments, they're working on contracts with them and getting the big money. How does your company compete for investigators, especially in light of that there is potentially a conflict of them wanting to do the trials for some of the branded products that are out there with the pharmaceutical companies?
Yeah, so, well, I think the unique situation, I mean, we particularly in the DeSci community we're talking about in decentralized science, a lot of investigators are actually quite frustrated with this model where they might have an off-patent drug or a nutraceutical that they're interested in. Recently, I spoke with a lady in New Zealand in my old university called Julia Ruckledge, who was looking at nutritional therapy, micronutrients to basically treat ADHD, and has been also bipolar disorder, and preventing or reducing risk of preterm births. And she's found that these therapies are quite effective. However, there is very limited private interest in those sort of therapies. So there are actually a lot of and there are a lot of researchers out there, even in the longevity field. We have a drug called rapamycin has been shown that it could be useful for treating, for improving healthy longevity, and unfortunately also off patent, so no private interest to look at this research. So I think there's a lot of and there's a lot of economic reasons why it's favorable to do this sort of research. It's usually much lower cost. You don't have to worry about safety as much, and you can potentially get to market a lot quicker because these drugs are already around us. So we think there are these researchers out there. It's just and I think they're very frustrated about the current model where, if their technology transfer office says that, well, we can't monetize this therapy, then there's no way that they can fund or get funding for larger clinical trials, except as a grant, which often, is very competitive. You might have only 10% chance of receiving a grant, and you have to stretch it out over 3 years to pay for your postdocs, versus, if it's a new patented drug, you get all the funding you need. So there's this real disparity, and this idea that it's a little bit strange that just because a drug is very patentable, it's seen as better medicine, and that's not actually the case. So I think scientists understand that, and doctors, I think, as well, when they realize that a lot of the patented drugs, a lot of them don't end up providing any more benefit. After 10 years, they figure out that the majority of them don't add any more benefit than the existing drugs. So even though maybe billions of dollars have been spent on those drugs. So there is a lot of inefficiencies, we think, that creating a new market incentive would help with.
So Savva, this is really interesting because, as you know, getting the life cycle, if you will, of a potential brand or product is just really the very early part of the life cycle to happen before a product can actually be utilized for the indication. Once you have the data, you have to go through regulatory review, and then there's a series around the reimbursement of it. So what happens after you have the data? Technically competing with various political lobby, legacy infrastructure and ideas to effectively get one of these products that's going to be competing with a branded product through a pharmaceutical company.
So yeah, as you say, first it's about collecting the data and using these clinical trial designs. We can collect the data around, say, which off-patent drug is effective, might be more effective than an existing patented drug. Once we have that data, obviously, doctors are permitted to use the drug off-label, and that's allowed. As we get more and more data, they can be more and more confident that can be used off-label, and you might have payers basically also reimbursing that drug. But as you mentioned, there is that last mile problem. How do you actually go out, educate doctors, determine that they are, so they know that this drug could be more effective, and create incentives to basically make better and better treatment protocols. So that's the difference, I think, between this interventional pharmacoeconomic model, where we're basically funding the clinical trial out of cost savings, and then moving towards this advanced market commitment model, where we negotiate, I think, well, the idea is that once you have sufficient data, say that ketamine is an effective treatment for depression, treatment is depression, you can spin off a company that will then negotiate and have the rights to, say, a method of use patent for an optimal treatment protocol. And the idea is that they would go and with those healthcare systems that are signed up to maybe your platform, you would negotiate advanced market commitments, where you would say, if we go ahead and fund the clinical trials and necessary, say, the phase 3, and get through FDA approval, and also do all the post-market pharmacovigilance, then you will agree to purchase our version of the drug for a minimum period, say 5 years, and this much per year. You might have other healthcare systems that don't want to use your drug, but they would be forced then to use the off-label version, which would be quite expensive, and you would price it at a level which is quite reasonable. The advantage of that is you also have, if something goes wrong, you have an entity that's responsible for the pharmacovigilance, for training doctors. Potentially also you could implement a reformulation strategy, do a slight reformulation, or innovate around dosing regimes. And then if something does go wrong, you would also have a recall insurance and insurance to cover things, and have someone to sue, essentially, which is actually an important thing.
Yeah, being the so
yeah.
So interesting so what exactly is your company, the Crowdfunded Cures? So are you acting more like a clinical research organization that enables the clinical trials? Are they small startups and biotech companies that leverage your resources to help them with, maybe a patent that they purchased from a big pharma company inexpensively? Or are you that company that then takes the product into full marketing? What exactly is the role of your group?
So there's a different side. There's more the crypto side, but then the platform, I think, is the more I guess that is the product, as it were, would be a SaaS platform, which essentially engages with payers to conduct these clinical trials and offers to manage a patient population in, say, an interventional pharmacoeconomic clinical trial, collects the data, and then monetizes that data. So as a clinical trial data platform, and essentially that healthcare systems would then have information about which off-patent drugs are safe and effective, and then it could also spin off and monetize, license out that data to, as we were saying, to repurpose off-patent drugs, and also at the same time engage with researchers and basically allow them to monetize researchers that are interested in generic drug repurposing and nutraceutical repurposing, and allow them to monetize that data, those ideas. So we're essentially a platform. It's sort of bringing together the different stakeholders, and as we sign more people up, there's less free riding.
Yeah, so you're almost like a connector. So tell us a little bit about where crypto fits into this entire ecosystem.
That's a little bit, there are different aspects, but the platform itself, data integrity is quite as important, say, for clinical trial data. As we were saying, it is a platform. So the idea is eventually, if clinical trial data is held on a blockchain, or at least verified, the FDA has been talking a lot about creating systems where it's auditable. You have a blockchain that basically allows you to see if information has been tampered with, and clinical trial data, when it's put onto a blockchain, it is immutable. Essentially, it can't be changed, and it also allows this kind of auditability. There is also an area which I'm very passionate about and interested in, which they call IP NFTs, which are essentially you can create almost like a new financial model for that early stage clinical research that wasn't profitable under the previous patent system. Say you are a researcher and you've figured out an optimal treatment protocol for a nutraceutical. Under the traditional system, you would need to sort of try and get a patent over that, say a reformulation, and enforce a monopoly price. It might not be possible to do that or raise money based on that, spin out a company. But there is this idea of this IP NFT, and we're working with a platform called Molecule, which recently raised $12 million for their IP NFT platform. And the idea is that an NFT is called a non-fungible token. It's essentially it represents a unique bit of data, let's say something unique. Traditionally, it's a picture, and people are trading pictures of monkeys and apes rather, and it has, but it can be used for almost anything to point to any bit of data. And the idea is that IP NFT can point to clinical trial data or a concept such as a treatment protocol that would treat a particular disease for an off-patent drug. And by issuing that IP NFT, you could then fractionalize it and raise money in this database and essentially improve liquidity. And the idea is that that's a lot quicker to raise money than, say, if you're spinning out a company and you've got to, it's very much harder to get liquidity into a company because it's not trading on a share market or anything like that. But with an IP NFT, you can basically get it on crypto markets, there's marketplaces, and start trading it. And it's a lot easier to do that. Of course, there are some legal issues with the idea as this IP NFT a security, but you can safeguard against that by ensuring that your investors are only accredited investors, or that you're doing a more limited promotion. But this is the idea, is essentially using crypto as a way to improve liquidity, particularly for that valley of death, the very early stage biopharma, and particularly, as we were saying before, those that biopharma IP that's not profitable because you can't monopolize it. But we bring it into this platform where you can basically monetize the data.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like a really interesting model, and we'll see how that looks. But at the end of the day, I think the thing that's interesting, Savva, is right now we are currently working with a lot of legacy infrastructure in the healthcare model, including in some ways some broken incentives for how pharmaceutical and biotech companies are bringing products to the market. It feels to me like we need some reform. I guess the question is ultimately, if there is, deep down cost savings for most payers, why isn't everybody going to getting on board with this? In your opinion, what kinds of reforms would need to be put into place so that basically all payers would be interested in this type of a model?
Yeah, I think there is a bit of inertia, ultimately institutional inertia. I think things are heading that way towards cost containment, and the idea perhaps that they have overseas in the NHS around this idea of QALYs, quality adjusted life years. But it's really about payer reform and looking at this financial innovation and doing new kinds of clinical trials to encourage payers to do something that they should already be doing, really. It could just be institutional inertia, and the fact that the idea of, say, monetizing clinical trial data is not something that and creating these new innovation, say advanced market commitments, it's similar to, actually very similar to what they do already with a lot of expensive cancer drugs, for instance, and orphan drugs. They do pay for performance, but usually that is the drug is a rebate if the drug doesn't meet expectations. But doing a pay for performance type arrangement with, say, a repurposed generic drug is not something that has traditionally been looked at by payers. There is a similar, although they're changing. So this idea of a Netflix subscription model, which in the UK for antibiotics, antibiotics have the same issue where they don't prescribe antibiotics. It's not very profitable because you basically have them in third line treatments. But with a subscription model, you pay basically a fixed amount every year based on the value of having that. And in the same way with the generic drug, you could again pay a sponsor based on the value and of the drug to the healthcare system, and not necessarily the ability to charge a monopoly price for every unit that you sell. So looking at these reforms, a lot of them are called, well, in academic spaces, it's called delinkage, where you're delinking the value of the medicine from the sales of the medicine. As you say, there's this perverse incentive under the current system to maximize sales of a blockbuster drug under the blockbuster drug model, and not necessarily to create more valuable data around how best we can use existing drugs or other kinds of therapies, or even the blockbuster drugs, to get better outcomes. And these require contractual innovation, I believe, and getting payers to use these sorts of things. That they're already heading in that direction with value-based pricing, but really, I think, definitely lobbying reform is a big part of it. There are a lot of.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds really interesting. I love the concept of the NFTs, potentially being able to take it to a regular day-to-day retail investor. There's pros and cons to that, of course. One of the potential downsides is that you're going to get a lot of noise in the market, a lot of competition for patients and in that. So before something bubbles to the top, so that potentially, but lots of really interesting things, including monetization of data, being able to get data out of some of the confines of some of these siloed areas so that we can get more into the, people using it in a much more robust way for population health management. What else are you really excited around the democratization and the monetization opportunities for everyday citizens to get involved and to get these drugs out of the earth and bringing them to fruition?
Yeah, I mean, so more on the Web3 side, the original idea was around crowdfunding as a way of crowdfunding sort of prizes, as a way of incentivizing people to generate that early stage data, particularly instead of, they call them impact markets. It's a little bit like carbon credits for, say, open source medicines or low cost medicines. You have somebody agreeing to pay an amount for the data, for successful clinical trial data. And this can help, de-risk a lot of these early stage, as you're saying, the noise, and get some, allow people to fund, say, early stage clinical trials, and then you can sort of put them into a different, more the Web2 side of things. So I'm quite excited about that side of the what they call the D-side, decentralized science community. Although I think that's probably a few more years away. Although there are people that are interested, and there's used to be at least people with more money in the crypto space. It's it's not so good at the moment. But I mean, that's the area. I think ultimately that's the area I'm most excited about, is this idea of monetizing data, because doctors and patients, they don't really care if you've got the latest, greatest drug that they're taking. Well, some of them care, but most of them really should only care about whether the drug works for them or what therapy might work for them. And if that's and ultimately that's about data and monetizing and understanding, going to more personalized medicine. And I think until, we get out of this blockbuster model and move towards models where essentially you have more of an algorithm, a treatment protocol, and where, you're importing, say, genetic information, blood tests, and all this other information. And then with that data, you're then optimizing or generating an optimal protocol for you, and then you might actually have, when you go to your doctor's office, you might be automatically enrolled in a clinical trial, particularly in a digital way, and so things like decentralized trials, where you might be automatically randomized, and ultimately just creating business models for generating more and more of this data.
What I think is really exciting, Savva, but for another discussion, is the real future of this, where eventually this will all be a bit of an NFT, digital discussion where there won't be any humans involved in any of the trials anyway. It'll be mathematical models, algorithms, trials in situ, in silica, organs on chips. And we have our digital twins. So this could be the future of investment and really interesting innovation. So very, very, very cool stuff. I think that's about it today. We could probably go on for hours with this conversation, and the future of it, we will have to take it step by step. For anybody who's interested in connecting with Savva, please take a look for his details and contact details in the show notes below. If you're interested in partnering and discussing things further with him, please also check out impetusdigital.com. We have these conversations a lot with payers, patients, allied healthcare providers, physicians, in a series of touch points in our platform with the various healthcare providers and stakeholders to be able to move work and ideas forward. So if you like this, please like and subscribe, and also please leave some comments on iTunes. We really appreciate everybody's time. And Savva, thank you for a fantastic conversation today.